idea in the end that they said it was a lot about values and about frames, and would be good if we would have a paper about that. So that was mainly the reason why we wrote the paper. It was a paper we wrote in about 2 weeks, so it was a very quick thing. But of course, it was rooted in some experiences we had previously. And I think I can say that one of the main reasons why we started to deal with the subject engaging citizens was the experience in 2016. This was when the Brexit bus was rolling through the UK. I think you all know this picture from some media. And when actually a wave of Euroscepticism was rolling through Europe. And in that period of time, we ran a conference in Belgium called Heritage Interpretation for the Future of Europe, and we felt very much this tension that we are, for us, it was very important to deal with the European project. And for many people in Europe, they were very skeptical about the issue and where are we going. And we were discussing and thinking, what is it, what unites us in Europe, and what is could be the influence, or should heritage interpretation at all have an influence on, which is basically a political development. When we were looking what unites us in Europe, we came very quickly to some very basic values we all share. Like I listed some of them here: dignity, respect, equality, diversity, pluralism, rule of law, solidarity, and tolerance. So these are some basics not only the European Union is based upon, but also the Council of Europe. So the European Union, it includes 28 states, but the Council of Europe includes all European states, and all have agreed that this is important for us for good reasons, because as you all know, we have a history in the 20th century which was not very happy in the beginning, and we tried to learn from what happened in the first half of the 20th century, and so the whole European project is based upon this. On the other hand, if we look how we communicate Europe, we often communicate Europe basically in economic terms. So we say Europe is important because we are a strong community and we are in competition with others in the world. We are in competition with China and whatever, and we try to forge a strong European community, and we are sure that everybody benefits from that. And so even if we are talking about education, which this small graphic in the corner shows, even if we are talking about education, we are talking a lot about knowledge and skills people should learn lifelong through their life, which helps them to be more successful and to achieve their goals. So it's a lot of success, achievement, economics, and the values are a little bit outside. If you look at the papers written in the context of Bologna or the PISA assessments, the values do not play a strong role. And so in the perception of people, how they perceive Europe, they often perceive it as a bureaucratic organization, which is basically good for cooperation and looking whether we can get something out of it. And this is basically, as you might remember, this idea which was written on the Brexit bus, or if we realize that we might put more in than we get out, then it makes sense to leave. And this, of course, has nothing to do with values and solidarity and whatever. It's just economic thinking. And this economic thinking is also taught in schools, at universities, wherever. We wrote a study the year before 2017, in 2016, about transient developments in Europe, which are important for heritage interpretation. And in this study, we came up with 5 key trends, and 3 of these 5 key trends were strongly linked to purpose. So that people are searching for purpose in their life, for purpose in their work, and not so much for success and achievement, which was very interesting and which was, of course, supporting for the idea to put the values a little bit more in the foreground. So in the end, we came up with this paper. You, I think, have all at least seen or looked shortly in, wrote something. You can download it for free from the material section of our website. So if you go to the Interpret Europe website, material, you will find it as the first entry. And we will also print it within a few weeks so that it is available when this award ceremony for the Altiero Spinelli Prize will take place in Brussels in June. The paper itself has 3 chapters. One is explaining what heritage interpretation is, how it works, what it does. The second is about Europe's shared values, and it also has a part where we analyze some studies about the perception of Europe at the moment in society, which is very interesting because there is a difference between how the so-called elite in the studies perceives Europe. So these are the people who have an influence on the actual development, are engaged in society, are playing a role, are thinking about what Europe is. Actually, in this definition, we as an NGO dealing with European ideas are also count to the elite. And there is a wider public, which basically the people doing their everyday life and do not care too much about what's happening in Brussels and what's happening in the political or cultural field, which are, of course, the vast majority. And there are several studies that found out that the perception of the elite is quite different from the perception of the wider public. So while we are often dealing with the elite, and this is going also through the media, what the official announcements are, the wider public might come up with another opinion. And actually, half of the wider public might support goals like solidarity, and the other half is more skeptical. This is one reason why we have results like we had the results in Britain. You know, it was basically a 50-50 thing, where half of the people said they would like to stay in the European Union, and the other half said, it might be better to leave. So it was, yeah. These are important studies and important findings, and we based our paper on this. I will not say too much about that in this presentation. So if you want to have a closer look, please go to the section in the paper to this second chapter, and there you have all the sources. So you can come back to the Eurobarometer studies and to the different Chatham House studies and to the studies that have been done in that field. The third part is how the European dimension can be included in heritage interpretation. This is, of course, for us the most critical part, because we have to prove that if we say, yes, we can include values and we can deal with these things, people will ask, okay, can you show us some examples how this works? This is really critical, and we really have to come up with these examples, because otherwise we cannot convince people. We know that. So in this paper, we have 10, we call them case studies. Actually, they are just brief descriptions of ways how we can include Europe, so to say, in heritage interpretation. I will roughly follow this scheme. So I will first say some things about how does heritage interpretation work. I assume that most of you are involved in the field, but I feel this is important for those from outside, that they have a little impression what we are talking about and what the key points are. Some of you know that I like to start with this very nice picture, which brings us on the first glance far away from all these political discussions and considerations. This is Yosemite Valley, and I like this picture so much because this little shelter, which you see in the center of the picture, is called, as you can see in the caption, a trailside museum. So they call this little shelter a museum, assuming that what is the artifact in the museum is actually there. It is out. It's out in nature. So they use the original site and describe it sort of like as an exhibition. And I feel the important message in this picture, or there are two important messages for me in this picture. The one important message is heritage interpretation should really relate to first-hand experiences, to something I experienced on site. And in this case, of course, it's the classical example. In this case, it is a wild nature site, but you can imagine you have such experiences everywhere in culture, in also political insensitive sectors. When we were at the conference in Mechelen in 2016, we were in at Flanders fields, so the battlefields of the First World War. This is first-hand experience. Or when we were in Hungary now at a conference, some of you might remember we were at the Iron Curtain. We were at the place where the curtain first was lifted. So this experience is a strong tool in heritage interpretation, a strong feature from where interpretation actually starts. And what starts from there is a process which starts in the people. So the people start to consider, to reflect, to work with this experience, to relate the experience to their life. And I like to use this quote very much, which is a very old quote from 1871 from John Muir. But this is a quote where interpretation first appeared in that context when John Muir said, "I'll interpret the rocks." So he himself interpreted the rocks. You can imagine him sitting there on the rock, looking at the other rock on the picture I've shown before. Learn the language of flood, storm, and the avalanche. I'll acquaint myself with the glaciers and wild gardens and get as near to the heart of the world as I can. So this is basically the goal of interpretation, bringing the people to as near to the heart of the world as we can. And the question is how we can achieve that. So if we want to build this connection between the people and their heritage, natural or cultural, our challenge is to find our role, to see what role are we playing in this interpretive triangle. So what is our job in this process? And this is quite interesting. It's quite challenging for us at the moment. Also, we have the discussion in our profession, what is our role? Is our role to tell the people something about the sites and make sure they get the messages, or is our role more to facilitate a process between the people and the phenomena? So this is a very interesting and tricky point, and I think all involved in heritage interpretation should be aware of that and should discuss that. But if you look at the triangle, the focus of the triangle is basically the center. So the question is, how can we bring these three things, us and our role, the phenomena and the people, how can we bring them together? What is meaningful to them? So what we put at the center of the triangle, this is actually the meaning of the whole process. So if we come up with the four corners, with the three corners, sorry, of the triangle, and this point in the center, we get 4 points. We usually call them the four aces of interpretation, which means the first one is we turn phenomena into experiences. The second one is we provoke resonance in the people, and we want them to participate. It's another tricky term, because the question is how far this participation can go or should go. We offer paths to deeper meaning. This is what Interpret Europe usually writes, and I think it's important to see that we offer paths, so it is not to teach them something about, but to offer something and encourage them to come up with their own ideas, and to foster stewardship for all heritage. So in the end, we would like people to appreciate natural and cultural heritage and make them part of their life and reflect what function and what meaning it has to them and it has to us. So these are the four aces, the four basic points we're usually talking about: experience, participation, stewardship, and at the very center, meaning. And if you're talking about values, I said that before, Europe's shared values, if you're talking about values, this part in the center is playing a very critical role. So the question, how do we deal with meaning in interpretive processes, is crucial for the question how or whether at all we can include such abstract things like Europe's shared values. It's the same, we do that already in our training courses, how we can include sustainability or sustainable development. All these abstract concepts are only attracting for people if they see a meaning in them. Some people say they are important because they come to the conviction that they are important, and so they appreciate them and live them. But for most people, it is important to experience a personal meaning in things before they say, yeah, that's relevant for me. I want to deal with that. So this meaning part at the center is very critical. And the question, of course, is in every interpretive process, how do things become meaningful to us? And tools we usually use in that context is we look for things that all of us, that connect all of us. For example, something like the idea of family. If we are talking about family, we can say this is an idea everybody is somehow influenced by. This does not mean that everybody is excited about his family or his relatives or her or whatever. It's not the point that we have the same opinions about something, but we are all somehow impacted by it. This is important. And we call these terms, most of you might know that, universals. So universal terms, which, like we have family here, we have others like hunger or courage or death or freedom. And as I said, they can be very controversial. So the idea, the concept of freedom can be very different in different countries. Also in Europe, it can be seen very different, but it is a concern for all people, freedom and being captured. And this is a subject that's always relevant. So our question is often, if you're talking about universal concepts, which are meaningful to all people in the world, how can we include them to make the people more interested in specific sites, heritage, in biology, biodiversity, in whatever, which at the first glance has not much to do with their world, with what they think about, and which is relevant for them. We can sort of frame this meaning, and this is a very interesting concept. I have an example here which shows it quite easily. If we are talking about home, some of you might think of your living room or your garden, or the things, the features you have that make your home. So you have an idea of what home is, and you have an idea of what belongs to home. But these are what social psychologists call surface frames. So we can recognize home through different elements, but all of you know that home triggers something much deeper in you. And I remember, I might remind you that Freeman Tilden was talking about larger truths, so larger truths behind the facts. And this is actually what is called the deep frames. So we have deep frames where home means much more to us than just the sofa or chair or cupboard or whatever, but it triggers something in us which is hard to describe and which is much deeper. But we have a clear idea of what it is. This is important. So if we are talking about home, I do not necessarily need to know what the home of someone I'm talking to is, but I have a clear idea why it is so important for him and what it means to him and what it triggers in him. So to work with these deep frames is something which is very critical if we want to come to the very heart of the people. And on the other hand, this is also a real challenge, and it is difficult because we can come to a point where we say we start to manipulate people by using such deep frames, and many advertisements are doing that. And this can change their perception of the world without they are really realizing it. There is a linguist in the United States, George Lakoff, who likes to use this example of the war on terror. I think all of you are aware of this phrase, war on terror. This was coined by the President of the United States in 2001 when the attacks on the World Trade Center happened. And he said 1 week after that, now the world is on war on terror. And war is one of these strong, deep frames like home. It's the same structure. So war is the same as home in the example before. And if we think of the surface frames, we know that a war needs an offender, it needs armies, it comes with battles, it comes with guns, people will die. in the end, there will be or might be victory. So there is a sort of a storyline here, which is triggered if we say we are on war. And if we accept that we are on war, we accept this storyline. We accept what's going with it. So it is clear, if we are on war, that people will die. And we have to accept it because we made this decision. We are in this frame. We are in a specific frame which allows something which wouldn't be allowed otherwise. And George Lakoff said if the president at the same situation would have insisted on the idea that this was a huge crime that happened, and we would follow that. We would have at the surface level criminals courts, trials and laws, and we might come to justice in the end. So it's a completely different storyline. So crime is a completely different frame than war, and it matters which frame we choose to influence developments. This is a very, very big example now, because we all know since 2001 this idea of war on terror is always with us, and there's a lot of conflicts going on around the world under that label. And there would have been a significant change in the world policy if President Bush at that time would have chosen this other frame, and the direction would have taken a different direction. Of course, this is not what we usually do at our heritage sites. It's on a much smaller scale, but I think this is very good to explain what influence we can have if we use frames and if we work with values, and what responsibility we have if we do this, which is actually one reason why it isn't done so often. It is quite neutral to teach skills or to teach knowledge or attitudes, and not so much go on this value level. So this is really a challenge if we decide we would like to do that. When we're talking about values, there are very different values we are all driven by, and there is one study from Shalom Schwartz. You can find that easily. A study which was a very huge, all around the world study. In most countries of the world, he was checking what values do people share. And he came up with this value circle. So you see there are different parts, different groups, and behind this value circle there was a value map. Don't be shocked, we'll be able to read most of these things, but this is not so important. He was just checking what values are there, and then he was grouping them following an arithmetic model. So the relation of these values to each other is really based on calculations. It is not arbitrary. It is based on calculations. And then after he did that, he tried to group these different values, because he found out that some values are closer to each other than others. And so he came up with different groups of values. You can see here, you have on top universalism values. These are values which have a lot to do with sharing and with nature and with feeling home and these things. And you have on the other side, if you look at the opposite side, you have a lot of power and achievement values, which means this is to build on the career, to come forward in the life, these things. Or hedonism is having fun. And on the other hand, you have conformity and tradition, which is more looking at, okay, what is appropriate, what should I do and what should I not do. So this is sort of an opposite for this stimulation and hedonism things. And so you can see it all is a system, and it all somehow makes sense. And the very interesting thing is here that we often assume that, yeah, well, most people want to go to this achievement direction, or power or security is very important to many people. But there are studies, especially in the UK, which showed that basically we all have all these values, and they are sort of in a balance usually in our real life. So we live all these values, and it is not that some people are absolutely universalists and other people are only powerful. They have all people, we have all these values somehow represented. But if we ask people now a question like, if we think about the future of Europe, if we think about how Europe should look in 10 years or in 20 years, what values should be important for the development, then we get a picture like this. You see, you have red dots here. You see a very much a concentration of red dots here in this part, and you have green dots. So green dots are the values where people think these are important for our future, and the red dots are those where they think these put more a risk on our future. And this is very interesting. I just picked that out from a whole bunch of such studies we have, and they were done in several workshops at conferences and in several contexts, not only with people dedicated to heritage, they're also with people from the economy sector or whatever. The tendency is always the same, that people say that the values in this part should be the values that should be strengthened, and the values in this part should be the values should not so much be strengthened. The interesting thing now is, if we look at the values we have in Europe, I've shown that before. They are all listed here. It's a quote from the European Union. Basically the same as I said: democracy, equality, rule of law, all these values. If we ask where are they in this value circle, then we find that they are almost all of these values are in this universalism sector. Some are in the benevolence sector. This is what is family and friends and close relationships, and some are in the self-direction sector. So this is I want to be independent, I want to create my own life and things like this. But all of them are in this part where most people also say, yes, this is what is important for the future. So this is very interesting, because we have a strong coincidence which shows that what is written in the papers for the European Union or for the Council of Europe has a lot to do with solidarity, has a lot to do with achieving something together. So these are bigger than self values. They're not really supporting egoism. And if we look what people think, it is basically the same. So there is not such a big difference. Of course, our real life has a lot to do with that different circumstances which bring us to behave in different ways. So our life is not just triggered by our values, it is triggered by offers we have from society, incentives, by punishments we receive because things are more expensive than others, and so on and so on. So in reality, this does not mean that all people behave like this, but they are open to this, and that is important, because the assumption often is they are not. There's a very interesting study from it was done by WWF UK, where they looked how their own communication work is set up, and they found out that their communication work is mainly directed not in these fields that are very important to them, but in other fields like achievement, because they thought people are like this. And if we want to be successful as an NGO, we have to meet these expectations of the people. But this is a vicious circle, because on the one hand, these expectations, of course, are supported by this when they are fed, and on the other hand, they are in the people, but we support them, and then we watch the people and say, oh, the people expect that, and we support them even more. So this is not the way it should work. There are very interesting studies. I show you in a minute the sources where you can find that in the internet. So behind this, what was a value map before, this was then moved into this figure of the value circle. So this is to explain how this circle came together. And you can see easily we have two axes in the circle. The one is from self-transcendence values to self-enhancement values, and the other is from openness to change to conservation. So this is more the progressive part, this is more the traditional part, and this is more the sharing part, and this is more the, I think, more of myself part. In this circle, there are some very simple rules at work. This is all supported by research, of course, so this is not a theory. One of these rules is the seesaw effect. If I want to strengthen something like universalism, I should not strengthen power and achievement. which sounds very, very logical, but which is actually what I said before, what an NGO as WWF did not do. They were strengthening the achievement sector, which means they weaken the universalism sector, and the universalism sector is let's put our forces together to do something for nature, for example. Yeah, so they weakened what they actually wanted to do. So this is something we should keep in mind if we work with values in interpretation. And another effect to have is the so-called spillover effect. It's also interesting, which means if you work very strongly in universalism, you also strengthen the neighboring sectors, which in this case is benevolence. So thinking of friendships, thinking of family, of being together with people, or on the other side, self-direction. So finding my own self, raising my self-esteem. This is closely related to universalism, which at the first glance, it's not logic if we support this, why we should support that as well. But this is a reality, and it counts. It's of course true for every sector in this circle. And if we go, for example, to this part, to security. Security comes very much with conformity, tradition, and power. Yeah, it makes somehow sense. So people who are very much dedicated to security ideas, which are very important in our society. They tend to be very open to this idea of tradition, conformity, and power on the other side. So you can go through this circle and you can see, okay, there are values that are close, partnered to each other, and others that are more opposing each other. And the interesting question for us in interpretation, if we think about our role, whether our role is maybe more a facilitating, a mediating role, then the question is, how can we, if we are convinced that universalism values are something which is worth to go for, how can we bring people who are very much in security values to the universalism part? And from what we learned from the circumplex, we could say, yeah, we can oppose them, yeah. So we create a tension here, but from our real life, we know that this usually does not work. If I confront someone with a rather opposite point of view, I often more strengthen him in his position than I convince him to come over. And I feel sometimes that we have this situation in politics where politicians very strongly get upset if people tend to the populism part, which is basically has a lot to do with security. Of course, the migration discussion has a lot to do with security ideas of people, whether they are real, I mean, whether they are based on facts, or whether people just feel they are no longer safe, it is no longer their country. It is a fact that it is like that. And then the question is, if they are opposed by others who get upset and who almost criminalize these people, what will be the effect? And in most cases, the effect will not be that they are convinced and say, okay, we do not want to be criminals, so we change to the other side. An interesting model in this context is this very old model of this value square, or there are different terms, value rectangle, where we see that a value, a virtue can have a sister virtue. That's going back to very old Greece, to Aristotle, who was talking about this, that about virtues and about sister values, sister virtues. So it does not necessarily need that there is an opposition. If it can also be a positive tension between something like openness and conservation. If we switch back to the circumplex, we have openness to change here and we have conservation there. So if we take these two terms, there can be a positive tension, which means a person which is very open can really well deal with a person who is quite conservative, as long as they feel, yeah, we're just we are on the same level, but we follow we have a different focus. But as soon as we push the people down into this negative tension. As soon as an open person calls a conservative person absolutely inflexible, then you have this negative tension, and then you come to a conflict. And if you end in this level, you will not solve anything. And this, I feel, is very, very important. We had that already in a project about heritage interpretation from 2003, a European project. This is very a model, because this is very important for our role as interpreters. If we want to have a role where we facilitate potential conflicts, and we want to bring people together, and we want to people to live, to learn about Europe and the environment from their experiences, then it is very wise to look at this rectangle and think, how can we use this to make our interpretation more attractive for very different people? If we are talking about sensitive points like we do when we talk about values and about frames. I promise I show you the background reading for this. Just note this one link here, valuesandframes.org. Valuesandframes.org, very easy. You can download a lot of material which is about this value circumplex and all these things I was talking about before, the study of Schwartz and the WWF study and all that. So you can find this here, valuesandframes.org. It's really, for me, it was one of the most important sources in the last years. It's really something to look at. So we found, and we had these discussions starting from 2016, and we found that we really need to consider what is our role in heritage interpretation, and whether heritage interpretation in itself as a profession might be on the move at the moment, and really needs to discuss some points that are in the tradition of our profession and that might change, like the role of participation, what participation is. Some of you might know that already Freeman Tilden used the term participation. He said participation is always something that has to be physical, so that people have to be involved with their heart, with their head, with their hands. But we need to consider now, is participation more? What does participation practically mean if people come to a heritage site? This goes a lot with what is discussed at the moment very much with co-creation. So do people co-create heritage? Is heritage set, and are we the experts telling people what it is, or how much space do the people have to think about heritage, to consider it, and much more, the values, the frames, the competences, meaning, universals. All these points are very briefly touched in this presentation. They are relevant for the further development, and we really need to have a discussion about the role of these different terms and the role of ourselves in the interpretive process, in this interpretive triangle. So there are some questions coming with that, and this presentation gives you more questions than answers for sure, because we really need to consider how to move forward in this concern. And also the Engaging Citizens paper says it's basically a start of a discussion. So this is nothing like a recipe. You take it and you use it. It is really, it should trigger thinking, and it should have consequences for our future work and what we are doing there. Around this triangle, I just noted a few questions. I was talking about manipulation, and we have to discuss this. So if we decide we want to support values like solidarity, sharing, and so on, how do we do that? Are we do that in an open way? And if we do it in an open way, if we do it transparently, is it then okay that we do it, that we use it? Can we use frames if we really reveal these frames to the people we are working with, or should we avoid it? So all this question about it is not just telling people messages about a heritage site, but it is about starting discussions which go really deep to the personality of the people. What right do we have to do this, and how can we do that in an appropriate way? And of course, on the other hand, what is our role as an interpreter, and are we still interpreters in a sense that we interpret something for the people, or shouldn't we more take the role of a facilitator, which helps the people to interpret on their own, as John Muir did in this quote at the very beginning of the presentations? And how can we, if we decide that we would like to encourage the people to interpret, how can we do this in, how can we empower them to do this in a responsible way? So you see, there are lots of questions raising from that. There are much more. I just picked up a few which result from what I said before, and I feel that this needs to be discussed in the profession. And we had a project, some of you might have heard of it, this Harry Q project, where we are talking about interpretive agents, and we could think that as interpretive agents, we could take roles like encouraging heritage stakeholders to deal with European meaning in heritage, to deal with values, to consider multiple perspective, to cover participation. So all of this could be sort of a job profile where we really try to promote heritage interpretation as a very important approach to achieve things which we might not be able to achieve on the level of formal education. You remember I said at the beginning, there are a lot of working with competences, with knowledge, skills, and attitudes. And if we want to more raise the value subject and talk about values, maybe we are better equipped for this in the non-formal learning area than schools or universities are. So we should consider that, and we should look whether we have a role to play in this. If we come to the very practical point, I was telling you about the conference we had in Belgium in 2016, where we were at Flanders Fields, and the question how to interpret an old battlefield is a very critical question. So you can learn a lot, and the whole European Union is based, it is basically rooted in these two devastating wars we had before. So we can learn a lot from what happened at that time, and it's really critical to think how we should interpret that. It is critical to think how we should interpret cemeteries or memorial sites, crosses and crosses and crosses all over Europe. And what are we doing with that? How can we use that in a way to trigger thinking in people and to make them becoming aware of their situation, to reflect upon their situation, not to manipulate them, but really to encourage them to use this and to come to some conclusions following from that. Interpretation is not necessarily something, I think, which is giving ready solutions. It can also just raise questions, or it can, most of you know, provoke is a strong term in interpretation. I took this picture at a railway station here in Germany. It's not far from here, where there were people deported to concentration camps in the Second World War. So this is an artwork. It's an old cupboard. It looks like someone left it there, and it's written on who left the cupboard, to whom belongs the cupboard, the suitcase. Sorry, the suitcase. Some of you might know that these suitcases are remains in for example, Auschwitz. So many people are reminded to that. But it's just you pass by, and your thinking is triggered by it. And I feel this is not so different from the Trailside Museum I've shown you at the very beginning, where you're just your thinking is triggered and you consider about something. You considered about a very nice nature site in that case, and here you consider about one of the worst things that happened in Europe in history. But you're not forced to it. You pass it by, you remember it. Sometimes you might think about it, sometimes not. There's another example of that kind. You see here, this is where the Berlin Wall was. So this is in Berlin, and when you pass by, there's a little plaque reminding you to that. So we could think of more such tools, reminding people, triggering thinking in people. And also, not only in these sites where really political things happen, but also in historic sites. I chose this very nice picture, very romantic garden in Italy, which has its history, and this history actually can be linked quite easily to ideas like solidarity or respect or rule of law. If we research in this direction, and if we say this is what we want to teach the people or to make the people learn about, this is possible. And in many cases, at the first glance, we would say, what does such a garden have to do with Europe's shared values? And if we start to research, not in the direction we usually do it with, okay, what different plants do we have here and what different epochs happened, eras happened in history. If we go a little bit deeper and research in the direction of the values and the frames behind these places, there are lots of things which can be interpreted quite easily. We shouldn't force that, I think. It's the same like we had this discussion a few years ago with sustainability. It doesn't mean that every phenomenon that is interpreted now should be interpreted through the lens of sustainability or through the lens of Europe's shared values. But I'm sure we find very many places where it is quite easy to do it and where it's quite easy to trigger thinking in people about such complex subjects. We received this quote. We received a welcome address when we had this conference in Mechelen in 2016, and this includes a sentence which I found was very strong. The welcome address from the Commissioner for Education and Culture, Tibor Navracsics, the commissioner who also opened our conference in Hungary a few weeks ago, and he wrote, through interpretation, I believe, heritage can contribute to the building of communities, not just at local level, but also at national and European levels. Bringing citizens closer to their heritage is about bringing them closer to each other. And this is an important step towards a more inclusive society. So I was very touched when I received this from a European commissioner, because it seemed that he really took that serious, our approach of interpretation, to help Europe to come more to an inclusive society. And I'm still driven by this idea, and I'm still working on this. And this study, which we brought together, engaging citizens with Europe's cultural heritage, I think is a very important keystone for developing this idea that we that we support the European project that way, that we encourage people to deal with heritage also against the background of our shared values in Europe. So this was a presentation. Thank you very much. And I hope it was not too long, because I see just we have 7 minutes left for questions, which are rather short. Marcus, I would ask you were putting some questions from the chat together. Maybe we can discuss them now.
So we have 6 minutes left for question and answers. So far there were no questions in the chat. So I would change the mode now to the question and answer mode. That would enable you to raise your hand. I showed you before how that works, but I explain it again. In the lower right corner, there's this smiley emoticon. If you press on that, and there you can raise your hand, and then we'll unmute you, and you can talk directly to us, or if you don't want to talk, you can type in your question or some comments in the chat box. So it's up to you to either raise your hand or type something if you have questions. So there's somebody raising hand, so, or not. Okay, Catherine, do you want to say something? Because I saw you raised your hand for a short time. Ah, okay, she's typing something. Do you see that, Thorsten?
Yes, I have a question about the seesaw effect.
Okay.
So what's the question? I go back to that slide, and we can see that. It is.
Okay, so we are waiting. There's the question, Thorsten.
And how to try to talk with your group, avoid the effect if possible. Mm. Is the question, I do not understand the question right. How to try to talk with your group and avoid the effect if possible. So is it about the confrontation then, that we should avoid the confrontation in when talking about the group? So this would be this other diagram, this one, right? Um, for for if I'm in the lucky position that I can talk to a group, then I think it is not that difficult if I just change my role from the one telling people something to the one listening to people. So if I encourage people to speak up, to come up with their own ideas, and I will have different ideas, and I might have confronting ideas, then my role would be in that case to facilitate the process and to come up, just to collect the different ideas and to come up with sort of a resolution, which does not mean I agree on the one or on the other, but which shows that there is this effect that we have confronting positions and that we can try to mediate them. So that would be my answer to that. I like to use this example, which I experienced in a long time ago at Grand Canyon National Park, where a ranger was telling about the geology of the canyon, and we had someone in a group who was a creationist, so he did not believe in this processes. He said the canyon was created within this process, which happened within 1 week when God created all the earth and everything around us and men and whatever. And I was very impressed when I realized that the ranger gave this person the stage and asked the person to explain how he thinks that happened. And it took only a minute or so. It wasn't even a minute. It was very short. I mean, to understand the idea is very quick, and to explain the idea is very quick. The question is whether you believe the idea or not. And the ranger said, yeah, there are some people who look at it like this, and we look at it like that. And so you see, there are different perceptions and different opinions about that. And I was very impressed by that because there was really no confrontation. I mean, in the end, I do not think that anybody was convinced in the group that this creationist position was one he would seriously consider for him or herself. But nevertheless, it gave us the feeling we are still one group and we are together thinking about how people perceive this. And that I found very valuable. So I'm not sure this is an answer to the question, but how to deal with these conflicts is something which is indeed challenging, and yeah, especially if we are talking about sensitive subjects like war and people on different sides, and people of different convictions. And actually, it's the same, I think, with the Brexit issue, which was a very emotional discussion in UK. It was not just about, okay, let's think about the facts. It was, yeah, you know that.
Okay, Thorsten, I think Catherine said, thank you, a great example for turning negative tension into positive situation. So thank you for answering the question. There's another question from Lena from Sweden. She said, thank you for the very interesting presentation. I was wondering how the paper is used now. Do you know who reads it? Where is it being picked up, etc.? And I think something related from Abby from Ireland. Can we get hold of the paper? Is it on the website? So I think this would be the last two questions for the presentation because it's already 10.
Okay, Abby, the question with the website. Go to the website, go to material, and it's the first entry there. So you can easily download it from there. Material, the material section on the website, the first entry, click on it and you can download the PDF. So that's very easy. The question from Lena, because the paper was rooted in this workshop for the task force for the European year, the task force distributed the paper to all stakeholder organizations all over Europe. It was distributed to all, I think, in the European Heritage Days, to all coordinators, to all national coordinators of the European year. So we can say it has really been directly sent to all these people and organizations taking responsibility for the moment, which is gorgeous. I mean, this is very different from sending something out to everyone. And we have the award ceremony in June, so we will go to Brussels, and we will be congratulated by President Tajani, the president of the European Parliament, and also Commissioner Navracsics will also be there. We will print the study in May for that reason, to have it available there, and then we hope that we can distribute it, for example, also at the European Heritage Summit in Berlin. Some other organizations we are partnering with, like Europark or like Europa Nostra, are very open to support us in that. So it's really, we feel that it's very, very welcomed. The question who read it and who is working with it, this is this is really a next step, because I know that many people say, yeah, great paper, and we like that and we appreciate it, but I would assume not many people read the paper, and not many people are really considering at the moment how to use it. So this should be the next stage, but I think until June we should really try to distribute it wherever possible, because when we get the award in June, we will really have a good wave which can carry it in different corners where it usually would not get. It's also, it sounds a little bit strange, but the fact that we receive money for the award opens the interest of many people. So many people are now interested because, oh, they got money for that, that must be good. More than if you give presentations or start discussions. So I'm quite optimistic that the paper will have an impact, but at the moment we are more working on, let's distribute it and let's make sure that everybody receives it. And when we have the award ceremony, we will use this to more encourage the people really to work with it and to do something with it. If we would start a discussion in Interpretive, is already in the training team where the new programs are prepared. They are really dealing with the paper now and thinking how to include it. So if we want to do this within Interpret Europe, please send us a short message just at mail@interpreteurope.net that you're interested in a more intense discussion, and I'm sure we will find formats to do that.
Okay, Thorsten, thanks again for your great presentation. Thank you all for attending our first webinar. I think it worked out very well from my side. So yeah, see and hear you next time. Have a great and nice day, all of you. Bye-bye.
Bye, bye, Joel.